BBC Radio for Schools. Radio History, 14 to 16. Working class movements of the 19th century. The Chartists.
The Chartist movement was a protest movement, important in Britain in the 1830s and 1840s. The people who supported the movement were mainly working class, unhappy with their living and working conditions, which employers and governments had done little to improve.
Come gather round, all you men, suffering with your plight. Attend the torchlight meetings held on mountains in the night. Missionaries bring us news from London, they've been sent to tell us of a charter that will reform all young men.
When you come to answering exam questions on this topic, it may be useful to bear in mind the reasons why working class people joined the Chartist movement. What made them Chartists?
Working men had hoped that the 1832 Reform Act would give them the chance to vote for members of Parliament. In fact, it extended voting rights only to a larger number of property owners or landowners.
Then, in 1834, the Poor Law Amendment Act made it impossible for the unemployed to gain poor relief unless they entered a workhouse. The workhouse regime was to be made deliberately harsh, poor food and little of it, hard, monotonous work, and families were to be split, children from parents, parents from each other.
In this way, the government reckoned, the out-of-work poor would quickly find themselves new jobs. But in the 1830s and 40s, there was a series of trading depressions. The manufacturers couldn't sell their goods, and they closed down their factories. At such times, there was no work to be found.
Some men had hoped to gain better conditions by joining trade unions. But the fate of the Tolpuddle martyrs and the collapse of the Grand National Consolidated Trades Union had temporarily brought an end to trade union support.
So, poor living and working conditions.
A Reform Act which denied working men the right to vote.
A Poor Law Amendment Act which forced the unemployed into the workhouse.
And, for the moment, a collapse of the trade union movement.
All of these things helped to prepare the ground for Chartism. If working people could find a way to make their voices heard in Parliament where the laws were made, then they might have a chance of using that power to satisfy their grievances. One man who wrote about his involvement with the Chartist movement was Ben Wilson, who lived near Halifax in Yorkshire. He wasn't an important figure in the struggle for the Charter. He was just an ordinary working man like many others who became supporters of Chartist demands. But he wrote an account of those times. And here's part of his story, based on his writings.
My uncle was a handloom weaver, and when I was 13, I went to help him in his workshop. My aunt was a well-known local politician, a Chartist, and a great admirer of Fergus O'Connor, editor of the Northern Star, a Chartist newspaper. It was through my aunt that I first became acquainted with the movement. While we worked, she'd tell us just what the Chartists were asking for. I'd sit and listen to the talk.
Number 1, universal suffrage. A vote for every man 21 years of age, of sound mind and not undergoing punishment for crime. Number 2, the ballot.
Aye, a secret ballot. No more voting by show of hands. No more men so frightened of their landlords and bosses that they have to vote the way they're told. That'd be better, eh?
Number 3, no property qualifications for MPs.
That means a working man could stand for Parliament without owning any land or house.
Why, so long as he could afford to stay off work and live in London for 7 years without a penny coming in.
Wait a bit. Number 4, payment of members. 5, equal constituencies. I suppose that's to improve on the old Reform Bill.
There's still too many small country places that have an MP all to themselves, while huge towns like Manchester only get one MP for hundreds of people.
And lastly, number 6, annual parliaments.
A new election every year? Well, that'll cost some.
That'd help the working man. Even you could afford to go to Westminster for a year if you got paid for it.
And if I had to stand again after 1 year, I'd be sure to keep me election promises. No, I'm sorry. I don't think you'll get the government to agree to all that.
I take it we'll not be seeing you at the meeting tonight then, Samuel. Fergus O'Connor's coming to speak to us.
I don't see what's to be gained by all these meetings. It's not for ordinary folk to challenge the way things are. Each man has his place in life and should be content to accept what's been chosen for him.
Nonsense! That's defeatist talk.
You're like all those folk who say, I haven't got time to get involved.
We can change things if we band together. If you'd been to any of our meetings up on moors, you'd begin to see that too. Thousands of people.
Aye, and all of them prepared to take whatever action is necessary.
Even if it comes to the use of force.
If need be, yes.
What's so good in that, Mrs. Wilson? There's nothing to be gained by violence, is there?
The handloom weavers of northern England became strong supporters of the Chartist movement. They saw it as a way of righting all wrongs, like the repeal of the Corn Laws, which fixed the price of flour. They saw it as a chance to protest against the new industrial processes that threatened to put them out of work, and to challenge a government that had passed laws which treated them harshly when they were unemployed.
We knew it wasn't going to be easy to get Parliament to pass a bill that'd give ignorant working men the right to vote, let alone stand for Parliament. Most MPs were quite satisfied with the voting system. It'd take tremendous persuasion, even force, to make them give way and pass the 6 points of the Charter into the law of the land. So, once the Charter had been published, there were two ways of going about it.
One section of the movement believed that they could get Parliament to accept the Charter by peaceful means. These were the Moral Force Chartists, led by William Lovett in London, where the Charter had been drawn up, and by Thomas Atwood in Birmingham. In the north of England, though, there was talk of violent action. This was where the Physical Force Chartists were most prominent. They wanted to frighten Parliament into accepting their demands. Throughout northern England, the Physical Force Chartists held meetings to urge on their supporters.
We believe it will bring freedom to our country and happiness to our homestead. You will get nothing from your tyrants but what you can take.
That was George Julian Harney, who wore a red cap like most violent men of the French Revolution and waved a dagger at meetings. Fergus O'Connor himself spoke to huge crowds on the open moors.
Shall it be said, fellow countrymen, that 4 million men capable of bearing arms and defending their country against every foreign assailant allowed a few domestic oppressors to enslave and degrade them? I have commenced the battle of suffrage with you, and you are the forces with which I will fight that battle, even to the death if necessary.
Even a Tory churchman like Richard Osler spoke out in defence of working people.
Workers of Halifax, have a brace of horse pistols, a good sword and a musket. They will petition for you. Arm for peace, arm for justice.
Arm for peace, arm for liberty, arm for justice, arm for the rights of all, and the tyrants will no longer laugh at our petitions.
We have resolved to obtain our rights.
We must have justice. We must have our rights speedily.
Peaceably if we may, forcibly if we must.
The Moral Force Chartists took a very different line.
Violent words do not slay your enemies, but friends of our movement. The whole physical force agitation is harmful and injurious to the movement.
We need muskets.
Oh, muskets are not what I wanted, but education and schooling of working people. O'Connor wants to take everything by storm and pass the Charter into law within a year.
Universal suffrage or universal revenge.
All this hurry and haste, this bluster and menace of armed opposition can only lead to the destruction of Chartism.
The local authorities appointed special constables to keep order. Magistrates were given powers to arrest armed Chartists. 5,000 soldiers were sent to the Northern District, commanded by General Napier. In some ways, he was sympathetic to the protesters, but he let it be known that they had no hope of gaining anything by armed rebellion.
Physical force. Fools. We have the physical force, not they. They talk of their hundreds of thousands of men. Who is to move them when I am dancing around them with cavalry and pelting them with cannon shot? What would their 100,000 men do with my rockets wriggling their fiery tail among them, roaring, scorching, tearing, smashing all they come near? Poor men. How little they know of physical force.
In 1838, the Birmingham Chartists suggested sending a petition to Parliament asking it to accept the People's Charter. There was also to be a general convention of industrial classes, a People's Parliament. This was to be held in London. Delegates from the main Chartist centres were elected to attend this People's Parliament.
In the West Riding of Yorkshire, we elected Fergus O'Connor as one of our delegates. We got signatures from thousands of workers to add to the petition. And finally, in 1839, the Charter and the petition was presented to Parliament. It had well over 1 million signatures, 2 miles long. They had to carry it to the Houses of Parliament on several huge wagons.
Parliament turned it down by 235 votes to 46.
So much for moral force. You can lead a horse to water, but you cannot make it drink.
So, in 1839, the Charter was rejected, and despite calls for a general strike, the movement declined for a number of years. It was always most popular at those times when trade was poor and unemployment was high. 1839 was one of those years. So was 1842. In that year, there were bad harvests and high prices, and the Chartist movement became popular once again. The Charter was presented to Parliament for the second time. It had more than 3 million signatures, and once again it was defeated by 287 votes to 49. The news was greeted by riots all over the north of England and Wales. There were strikes too. Once again there was talk of armed rebellion. In Ben Wilson's hometown of Halifax, the physical force Chartists were once again preparing for action.
William? Aye, I'm in the cellar. Come down.
You sent for me. What are you doing?
I'm casting bullets. Preparing to fight. Will you join us? Can you get hold of a gun?
You know, I support physical force, but it's a serious offence for a Chartist to have a gun or a pike in his possession.
We tried peaceful means, and what happened? The Charter's been turned down twice. You seen this?
What?
It's a pamphlet telling us how to put up barricades and fight on the streets.
Where'd you get it?
Never you mind. But will you fight with us? You're old enough now.
They'll send troops again. How can we hold out against an army? You've got to be organised to do that, William.
That's just what we're trying to do. Get ourselves properly organised for them this time. We've stopped the mills in Lancashire.
How?
We took the plugs out of the steam engines so machinery can't be used. We're going to get the Yorkshire mills stopped and all. And that's just the beginning. They'll see what happens if they keep on refusing to listen. It's time for action, Ben. You going to help us take up the fight?
Yes, I'll fight.
But the government acted quickly. Before the Chartists had decided on a proper course of action, troops were sent to put down the disturbances. Ben described what happened when they arrived in Halifax.
On their arrival at the bottom of the hill, they started off at full speed amidst a shower of stones and bricks thrown at them. One of them took shelter in a closet and was soon surrounded by the people who took his sword from him. He begged for his life, but died in a short time afterwards from injuries he'd received. The soldiers then went up to Ackroyd's shed and fired into the mob. A man named Sloan had his boot heel shot off. Several others were wounded, one of whom died whilst being conveyed to the infirmary. The soldiers then returned into the town, and in King Street, a man coming to his door to see what was the matter was shot dead. The struggle was short, fierce.
59 northern Chartists were arrested and tried on a charge of seditious conspiracy, and peace was finally restored. In the years that followed, there was an improvement in living conditions, even for working classes. Trade was good again, but the improvement was short-lived. In 1848, there were revolutions throughout Europe. There was widespread unemployment at home. The Chartist movement revived once again. By now, Lovett and most of the moral force Chartists had left. Fergus O'Connor was firmly established as leader. He'd also become an MP. In April 1848, he was to speak at an enormous rally on Kennington Common in London. From there, the charter was to be taken to the Houses of Parliament. The government was nervous. Remember what had happened in the north. The Duke of Wellington was put in charge of defending the capital. No one can be sure just how many people turned up on Kennington Common that morning. It may have been 20,000. The last to arrive were the Chartist leaders, riding in a wagon. Before them, another wagon decorated with red, green and white tricolor flags. This held the petition. The crowd waved placards and cheered their MP, Fergus O'Connor.
Mr. O'Connor, would you mind leaving for a moment, sir, to have a word with Colonel Main, Metropolitan Police Commissioner?
Very well, I will come.
Thank you, sir.
Oh, I'm going of my own accord. All is well.
Mr. O'Connor, London is prepared for siege. Even the Queen has left for Osborne. Now, I'm under orders not to let your procession cross the river and go to Westminster. I'm sorry, but those are my orders.
Mr. Main, I quite understand. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Fellow Chartists! Fellow Chartists, I beg you to disperse. I would go down on my knees to beseech you. Do not now destroy the cause I have struggled for all my life.
They repacked the petition into 3 horse-drawn hansom cabs. O'Connor took it to Westminster, and it was turned down for the 3rd and last time. Even though the petition had over 1 million genuine signatures, some had added names like Mr. Punch and No Cheese and Queen Victoria to the document. It was laughed out of Parliament. And that marked the end of the Chartist movement. Working people now turned from political action to industrial action. They formed new and stronger trade unions, though only skilled working men could join them. Chartism had failed. The movement had been deeply divided between supporters of moral and physical force. The leadership was divided too. The middle classes opposed Chartism, as did the trade unions. The government used the army, spies and special constables to suppress the movement. And from the middle of the 1840s, the standard of living began to improve slightly for working people. In spite of its failure, Ben Wilson was convinced that the struggle had been worth it. He remained a strong Chartist supporter to the end of his life.
A great many tales of sorrow can be told, but enough has been said to show that those were times to make men desperate. For life then was not so valuable as now. The Chartists were called ugly names, the swinish multitude, unwashed, and levellers. But what they wanted was a voice in making the laws they were called upon to obey. They took a leading part in agitating for the repeal of taxes on knowledge, education, cooperation, civil and religious liberty, and the land question. For they were the true pioneers in the great movements of their time.
The charter and our sterling ways will change. A better way of life, it says, is well within our range. Unite together, working men, and without any doubt.
Radio History was presented by Frank Partridge. Taking part were Paul Copley, Elizabeth Choice, Joe Dunlop, Steve Hodson and John Strickland.